Now for global business updates, Rotus Oddiri joins us. Good morning, Rotus, and happy Independence Day.
Happy
New month too.
Exactly.
Happy new studio.
Happy everything. Happy Independence Day to you, Dr. Bati, Ayo, Rufai, and all our viewers out there. We put together a look back on Nigeria's economy over the last 65 years. But just to touch on President Tinubu's speech, which I thought is the kind of speech you give when you're in the middle of reforms, pointing to what has worked. This is what is anchors almost everything for the country, is the exchange rate. And you can see the line going all the way down to 1,488, right? As far as September is concerned, we started at 1,526. Going back to 2024, March, it was 1,800. Beyond the exchange rates, the president also talked about a number of other reforms. But what you can see as far as, we can move on from the exchange rate now to the inflation. A stable exchange rate is what has given us disinflation between April and August of this year, to where we've gone down to, or decelerated to 20.12%. And also with respect to our economic growth that the president mentioned, 4.23% GDP growth. These two arrows here, the one is where he got into office in Q2 2023. The last arrow to the end there is where we had the rebasing, 4.23%. Beyond rebasing, the key thing here is oil production, and the fact that the president mentioned that oil production, which is part of the target of this administration, for it to grow. So if you look at oil production, 1.68 million barrels per day for oil production is what also, boosted this GDP growth that we saw. And particularly the growth of the oil sector, 20% growth, 20.46, larger than what we saw in Q2 2024, Q1 2025. That is what has anchored most of this growth. But let's quickly get to our report that looks back on 65 years of the ups and downs of the Nigerian economy. At independence, Nigeria's economy was built not on oil, but on the land. There was cocoa from the west. There were groundnuts from the north, also palm oil from the east. Agriculture accounted for more than half of GDP, employing the vast majority of Nigerians. At that time, the naira had not yet been introduced. The Nigerian pound was pegged close to the British pound, giving stability. The Nigerian pound exchanged for about $2.80 back in 1960. The World Bank estimates the nation's population was about 45 million people, with GDP at $4.2 billion. Oil only accounted for about 3% of exports, with early commercial output in 1958 pegged at 5,000 barrels per day. By the 1970s, the discovery of oil had transformed Nigeria. From just 500,000 barrels per day in 1970, production surged past 2 million barrels within 5 years. The 1973 oil shock quadrupled global prices and Nigeria's revenues skyrocketed. Oil as a percentage of exports rose from 3% in 1960 to 58% in 1970 to over 90% in 1975. The oil boom of the 1970s gave way to a crisis in the 1980s. When global oil prices collapsed, Nigeria's revenues plummeted. Ambitious projects stalled, debts piled up, and inflation soared to 54.5% in 1988. Under the military regime of General Ibrahim Babangida, Nigeria turned to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, demanded tough medicine: currency devaluation, subsidy cuts, trade liberalization. The tough medicine didn't go down well with the populace. The harsh economic conditions led to protests, led by youth through the National Association of Nigerian Students. Nigerians collectively called for the abolishment of the Structural Adjustment Program, with the protests leading to scores of arrests. By 1999, Nigeria emerged from years of military rule and economic stagnation. The return to democracy brought renewed hope and a new reform agenda under President Olusegun Obasanjo. Obasanjo pursued debt relief, anti-corruption reforms, and restructuring of state-owned enterprises. By 2005, Nigeria secured an unprecedented deal with the Paris Club, writing off $18 billion in external debt. A revolution was unfolding in communications. The licensing of GSM networks in 2001 unleashed a telecom boom. By 2010, mobile subscriptions soared to over 80 million, reshaping business and daily life. Banking reforms followed. In 2004, the central bank consolidated 89 fragile banks into just 25 stronger institutions. Nigeria's financial system began to deepen, fueling growth and investment. By the end of the decade, Nigeria was among the fastest growing economies in Africa. GDP growth averaged between 6 to 7% annually. A new narrative was forming, with Nigeria as a rising mint economy alongside Mexico, Indonesia, and Turkey. By 2014, Nigeria was riding high. Just months earlier, a GDP rebasing program had nearly doubled the size of the economy, making Nigeria the largest economy in Africa. But the optimism was short-lived. Global oil prices collapsed from over $100 per barrel in mid-2014 to under $40 by early 2016. For a country where oil made up 70% of government revenues and over 90% of exports, the impact was devastating. After the 2016 recession, Nigeria entered a slow recovery. Oil prices stabilized, but growth remained fragile, averaging barely 2% between 2017 and 2019, below the pace of population growth. Government pushed for diversification, reviving agriculture, supporting small-scale manufacturing, and encouraging a booming tech ecosystem. By 2019, Nigeria's fintech startups were raising record sums of money, turning Lagos into Africa's financial technology capital. In 2019, Nigeria signed on to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, promising new opportunities for integration and export diversification. But in 2020, COVID-19 struck. Oil demand collapsed, prices briefly went negative, and Nigeria's economy shrank by 1.8%. The shock highlighted once again the dangers of oil dependence. Recovery began in 2021, driven by agriculture, services, and a gradual rebound in oil. But scars remained: rising unemployment, mounting debt, and inflation above 17%. In recent years, Nigeria has faced its toughest reforms yet. In 2023, President Bola Tinubu announced the removal of fuel subsidies, a policy long deemed unsustainable. Overnight, fuel prices tripled, triggering inflation pain, but freeing billions of dollars in government spending. At the same time, the central bank, under new leadership of Olayemi Cardoso, floated the naira, or managed float. The exchange rate, once tightly controlled, more than halved against the dollar. Inflation surged above 30% by 2024, squeezing households, but policymakers argued it was a necessary correction. From a low of 1,800 naira per dollar in March of 2024, the naira has stabilized to under 1,500 in September of 2025. This on the back of the reforms carried out by the central bank. Another rebasing of GDP was carried out by the Bureau of Statistics, increasing the size of the economy to $243 billion in 2024. Rebasing of Nigeria's inflation basket was also carried out. Thanks to stability of the naira, inflation has decelerated for 5 consecutive months in 2025, from April to August to 20.12%. GDP growth in the second quarter of 2025 was 4.23%, the fastest pace in 4 years, driven by increased oil production of 1.6 million barrels per day and growth in the oil sector of 20.46%. These improvements in the economy led the Central Bank of Nigeria's Monetary Policy Committee to cut rates by 50 basis points for the first time since 2020 to 27%. Looking ahead to the next 65 years, we asked Chinwe Egwim, Chief Economist at the Collaborative for Frontier Finance and World Economic Forum Global Leader, to share her thoughts on what would transform Nigeria's economy over the next 65 years.
So transforming Nigeria's economy over the next 65 years really starts with the choices that we make now, which is building stability, attracting long-term investments, and creating opportunities for our people. I'm going to run through a few pillars. One would be macro stability as the bedrock. The first priority is macro stability, credible fiscal and monetary policy that tame inflation, anchor the currency, and restore investor confidence. Transformation also requires productive capital formation. That means crowding in private and development finance into infrastructure, such as power, transport, digital connectivity, and creating risk-sharing frameworks as well that perhaps let pension and insurance capital co-invest with development partners. We also need to reposition trade in such a way that We see reduction of non-tariff barriers. We see a strengthening in regional value chains because this gives exporters predictable access to FX and logistics, so Nigeria firms can compete effectively. The next I would say is financial system as an engine and not just a mirror. Our financial system can't just reflect the economy, it has to lead it. That's why deepening local capital markets, mobilizing domestic savings into long-term vehicles, and strengthening the development finance architecture is very critical with this journey into 65 years.
At an event in Owerri, Imo State, President Tinubu said the country has turned the corner. Nigeria's burgeoning youth population, corporate sector, rural communities, and everyone will be hoping that's the case. For Arise News, Rotus Oddiri.